Hello everyone, I'm Farwa Aamer, the Director of South Asia Initiatives at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to ASPI and Express Tribune's second joint webinar, this time discussing Trump's second act and what it means for Asia and Pakistan. 2024 has been an important year for political transitions across Asia and the globe. Of course, the decisive re-election of Donald Trump last month was a key event. Trump is now set to return to office in January of next year, once again as the President of the United States. But what does this mean for Asia? What will be the incoming administration's policy towards China? And what will be the implications for regional countries like Pakistan? To unpack all this and more, I'm thrilled to be joined by a brilliant panel. Daniel Russel, Vice President of International Security and Diplomacy at ASPI, Dr. Maleeha Lodhi, former Ambassador of Pakistan to the United States and former Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the UN, and Kamran Yousaf, journalist and host of the review on Express News. Thank you all for your time. But before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. We'll have a few questions for the panel on my end, and in the latter half of our session today, we'll take some questions from the audience. So please use your Zoom Q&A function to send in your questions, and we'll try to get to some of them. So without further ado, if I could just begin with you, Danny. Throughout the campaign and the key nominations that have been coming in for the incoming administration, it appears to be quite evident that China will remain sort of a central focus of US foreign policy. How do you see this relationship between US and China evolving under a second Trump presidency? Also, beyond China, what are some of the implications for Asia at large?
Well, first of all, Farwa, thanks for having me. This is a great panel and a great topic. I think we can see pretty clearly that a second Trump administration is already set to start with a very tough stance towards China. From the threatened 60% tariffs against China to the lineup of China hawks in Trump's new cabinet, his key advisors, and so on. We can read those signals. I think the big thing, the highest certainty, is over tariffs. Trump has made no secret of his conviction that tariffs are the greatest thing ever invented. He's tariff man. He's also promised to revoke China's trade status, so-called PNTR, that was adopted back in 2021. And there are many in Congress who are in favor of taking that radical step as well. Whether they will follow through or not, because there are profound commercial and economic implications, is an open question, but it's sort of an indicator of the rough and tumble start that we're going to see. Trump's focus, we know, is very much about reshoring, about supply chain security, about reducing dependence on China. It's about imposing restrictions on US companies that are operating in the Chinese market and making it harder for Chinese companies to enter the US market. We're going to continue to see sanctions and tightened export controls on sensitive technologies, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and so on. On the security side, I think Trump is sending mixed signals on defense issues. You know, there's what he has said, and then there's the people that he has chosen in the cabinet, and then there's what they have said. And together that presents a pretty contradictory, a pretty mixed picture right now. But I definitely think we should expect more action that are aimed at China or that are in overt support of Taiwan, actions that Beijing is going to find very provocative and is going to feel compelled to respond to. But I think the real wild card here, not surprisingly, maybe, is Trump himself. You know, he wants to deal directly with Xi Jinping. He thinks that he and Xi Jinping have a very special relationship. And there's this recent, to me, wild report that he's invited Xi Jinping to come and be in the audience during his inauguration ceremony at the US Capitol on January 20th, which would really be something. In any event, the people that he selected for the cabinet positions are mostly very tough on China. The Congress is certainly tough on China. What would happen when the two leaders actually sat down and tried to make a deal, though, is a very different question. I guess the last thing I would say on the implications for the region is that we're seeing already regional polarization, that it's getting harder for countries in Asia to navigate between China and the United States to avoid running afoul of one while dealing with the other. So the US has export controls that prevent non-US companies from sending certain products to China if they contain American parts or technology. China just imposed a very similar kind of mirror image set of restrictions on non-Chinese companies handling critical minerals that came from China. So it's getting harder and harder to navigate between these two systems. And so I think regional trade, regional investment is going to suffer as there's more decoupling, as both the US and China are pushing for exclusive agreements. And beyond just technology or trade, I think Beijing and Washington are going to continue pushing third countries to align their policies. And if they don't, to risk some sort of consequences, penalties. And the problem is by far the most severe, I think, for US allies who also have very important economic relationships with China. So on the one hand, the Trump administration is going to push them hard to stand up against China, to go along with tough measures, tough policies that Beijing strongly opposes. On the other hand, the Trump administration is putting a lot of pressure on them over other things like their defense spending and tariffs and so on. And so where that leaves them is really uncertain as to whether in a pinch the United States is really going to back them, or whether the Trump administration could make a sudden U-turn, make a deal with China, and leave them out in the cold, so to speak. So this is a rough patch for the rest of Asia, in my view.
Thank you so much, Danny. So we see a tough China policy and a possible U-turn leaving regional countries in sort of a rough patch. They're already preparing for it, and we'll tap into it a little bit more later. But I do want to come to Dr. Lodhi now, speaking of uncertainty. You, as somebody who's been watching the South Asia region for a while, we all acknowledge that South Asia is geostrategically, geoeconomically, and geopolitically an important region with sort of a complex history of engagement with the United States, and an interesting one as well. And as we see some of the relationships of the United States in the region, in South Asia, India has emerged as an important regional partner. We expect a lot of policy continuity with India. There's also a bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C. with regards to Indian policy on the whole. But with other countries, there is a lot of uncertainty. But given that the year South Asia has had, or the past couple of years, there's a lot of instability, a lot of political transitions, leadership changes in the region as well. How do you think is South Asia preparing for Trump 2.0? Over to you, Dr. Lodhi.
Thank you. Well, I think like the rest of the world, South Asia is wondering how unpredictable Trump's foreign policy is going to be in general. I mean, here is somebody who is to some extent a known quantity from his first term, but this is his second term, and there is no reason why the past has to exactly mirror the present or the other way around. So I think the first question is really one of uncertainty, how he's going to really engage with South Asia. Now, you already identified India as America's partner of choice, and that is correct. I think that's the lens through which I think the Trump administration will engage with the rest of South Asia, to my mind. But I think more importantly, it's the China lens through which Trump will see South Asia. And as far as my country is concerned, because I really can't speak for the other countries of South Asia, except just to say that on Afghanistan, I mean, sometimes we include that in our definition of South Asia, and sometimes we say, no, that's Southwest Asia. But at any rate, I think the disengagement of the United States from Afghanistan will continue. I don't think the Trump administration will have much of an interest there, except to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't emerge once again as some kind of a hotbed for international terrorism that can threaten the United States. But beyond that, there really is no interest at all. With Pakistan, I think in recent years, we've seen what I call a period or a process of benign disengagement. There hasn't been much there in the relationship between Pakistan and the United States since the US military withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I know we will speak more specifically to the Pak-US relationship later, but I will say this much, that in my country, obviously, we are looking towards the Trump administration and asking how interested it would be to re-engage with Pakistan, because the Biden administration really, beyond the help that Pakistan extended to the Biden administration for the US evacuation from Afghanistan, beyond that, there really wasn't very much. And low-level diplomatic engagement is what took place. In fact, a very good indicator of the interest the Biden administration took in my country was the fact that America's foreign minister, its Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, didn't once visit Pakistan during the entire Biden administration's term. So that says something about the lack of sufficient interest or high-level interest. But clearly, I think one would want to see the extent to which the United States will use the China lens to have relationships with the rest of the countries in South Asia. Pakistan's strategic priority today is China. It's not the United States, because it is China that meets Pakistan's defense and economic interests in a way that the United States simply cannot. Plus, the US has made its strategic choice in South Asia, which is India. Pakistan has made its strategic choice, which is China. So I think for Pakistan, I think the preparation would be to try to explore what is the space then for a future relationship between Pakistan and the United States, between the US relationship with India, its policy of containing China, and of course, Pakistan's strategic relationship with China. So in other words, these are going to be, in a way, structural constraints on the kind of relationship that may emerge under a Trump administration once he takes office. So I think this is a wait and see period. Preparations, yes, Pakistan doesn't have the same kind of concerns that other countries do on, if the US imposes tariffs, because it's not just China that Trump has said he wants to impose tariffs on. He has also said that he'll impose tariffs on countries that have a trade surplus with America. And he said 10 to 15%. Now, I don't know, we don't know the extent to which his administration will actually do that. It's all very well to say that during a campaign, but it's quite different. It's not easy. Tariffs would also mean higher prices for the US consumer. And I think Trump, as a wily businessman, knows well that he will not want to alienate people in his own country, citizens of his own country. So I think on the tariffs issue, of course, it's an important issue to be watching to see how far Trump actually realizes what he has pledged during the campaign. But as I said, I mean, it will obviously affect India much more than Pakistan. We have, yes, of course, that the United States is our largest bilateral trading partner. The EU is our largest trading bloc. But our trade with the United States is not really that significant. It's not a very large volume of trade for it to worry Pakistan in terms of higher tariffs, should he decide to do what he has promised. So I think, overall, I would just, conclude my answer by saying this is a period of wait and watch, basically. Some things seem to be set. But then we're dealing with a gentleman and a person who's most unpredictable. I mean, this is a man who we are hearing reports as, you was just mentioned, he's inviting President Xi Jinping to his inauguration. I mean, this is who he is. He just likes to surprise. So I think, one will have to be very careful and not to say very concrete things, because he has this element of upending all sorts of assumptions that we may make right now. So I would also be amongst those who will want to wait and watch and see what he says, for example, in the State of the Union address, and what he says in his first few announcements when he actually takes over the White House.
Thank you, Dr. Lodhi. It is indeed a period of wait and watch and see how the incoming administration will sort of play out its policy towards South Asia or any other region for that matter, or bilaterally with countries. It's also a time where you really want to see and ask if South Asia is ready for surprises, that is, enjoy surprises. How well does it do with surprises? I think there's a degree of calculation that needs to be done, for which, Kamran, if I can come to you now, we've talked about US and China. We just discussed South Asia. But another important element is US's relationship with the Gulf states or the larger West Asia region. And these countries are also important to South Asia, but also particularly to Pakistan. How do you see any shifts in US policy towards this part of the world, the Gulf and the Middle East and West Asia part of the world, having any sort of implications or spillovers on the region, South Asia, and how would it impact Pakistan's own sort of geopolitical and economic calculations?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Of course, looking at the current scenario, of course, a lot of people talk about that there is an element of unpredictability when it comes to President Trump. But of course, I think on a couple of issues, I believe that he is very much predictable. I think once he takes over, he will be more confrontational towards Iran, of course, Pakistan's neighbor, China, that we already talked about. And when it comes to Iran, let's look at it, Iran-Pakistan relationship, because the context is important. We do have certain issues of mistrust, Pakistan-Iran relationship. We share border, and that was the reason we couldn't realize the true potential despite being neighbors. But the key factor that played a role or drive this relationship, US policy towards Middle East, particularly towards Iran, then Pakistan's relationship with the Arab countries. And when during President Trump's second term, there was a historic deal between Iran and the Western countries regarding their nuclear program. There was certainly a hope in Pakistan that this deal might pave the way for Pakistan to have the kind of relationship that really it hoped for, particularly the key energy projects like Iran gas pipeline that was really not taking off for the simple reasons because Pakistan feared that if Pakistan implemented that project, it could invite US sanctions. And then came President Trump in 2017. He unilaterally walked away from that deal, diminishing any chances of, Pakistan-Iran close cooperation. So despite desire on part of Pakistan and even Iran, under President Trump's first term and even overall even President Obama's term, it is always difficult for Pakistan to have the kind of normal business and trade relationship with Iran. And given it is very much clear that what kind of policy that he will adopt, President Trump, things will be very challenging for Pakistan. And don't forget, during the first term of President Trump, Iran was still very much strong. The so-called axis of resistance or their proxies were very much active. They successfully thwarted the US and its allies' attempt to remove Bashar al-Assad. Now look at the situation. Iran is facing a difficult scenario. They suffered a serious setback when it comes to their proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the fatal blow that probably in the region they had to deal with, the ouster of Bashar al-Assad. So in this situation, though, President Trump clearly stated that he is not going to start a new war, but this scenario, Iran is currently very much vulnerable. Israel will certainly take an advantage. And if this happens, this will certainly create more problems for Pakistan. Chances of any substantive engagement with Iran, increasing trade and business relationship, I don't think so. It is going to materialize. But then there is also maybe a light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to the relationship, Pakistan relationship with Saudi Arabia. That's where Pakistan could see, some positivity. You know that under President Biden, relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US were really strained. For some time, Mohammed bin Salman was not, or even President Biden was not talking to MBS. And we know historically, the close relationship chemistry between MBS and President Trump, and also close relationship between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. So if anything bad happens or a negative fallout of US policy towards this region under Trump, Pakistan, like in the past, could fall back on Saudi Arabia that can play some kind of role to ensure that Pakistan's interests are protected. But then there is also the flip side of it. If Saudi Arabia helps Pakistan, in the past also helped Pakistan, if Saudi Arabia helps Pakistan in the current scenario, then Pakistan's policy when it comes to the Middle East or larger geostrategic policy will have to align with Saudi Arabia and the US. And that can also create a problem for Pakistan to maintain a kind of a delicate balance in its relationship with Iran and Saudi Arabia. So it is a difficult proposition, I believe, for Pakistan. But although it is a cliche that whenever there is a crisis, there is an opportunity, probably there is also an opportunity for Pakistan, because for so long that we have relied on others to navigate through difficult challenges. Perhaps under President Trump's second term, Pakistan may have an opportunity to look inwards. There are issues, there are things that not under your control situations, but then there are certain areas that are in your control. So Pakistan can focus on these things. But certainly there will be a lot of challenges for Pakistan at a time when Pakistan desperately needs more trade with their immediate neighbors, particularly with whom Pakistan has better relationship. But it seems that on one hand, you have Iran that will face increased pressure from US as well as from Israel. Then you have China that will, of course, the number one priority of President Trump. And you have India that Pakistan has confrontational relationship, and under President Trump, relationship with between US and India may further improve. So interesting and difficult times, I would say, for Pakistan.
Thank you, Kamran, for your candor. It appears that Pakistan is in between a rock and a hard place, really, with trying to solidify its relationship with some of the key countries that it already has somewhat of a stable equation with, but also looking for a reset, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But if I may come back to you, Danny, since we've discussed South Asia and how the region is expecting surprises, but given Donald Trump's transactional foreign policy approach, how well do you think Asia is prepared to deal with that? And including important regions like Southeast Asia, because the United States has a vested interest in that region as well. Plus, you touched upon this earlier when you said it leaves the countries in the region a bit of a rough patch, deciding between US and China. How a more intensified and a confrontational US approach to China might impact the geostrategic and economic landscape, particularly in Asia?
Well, those are great questions, and there were great insights by the two other speakers. Thank you. My experience is mostly in East Asia, and so that's where I can speak with a little more confidence. But I think that the answers to these questions about transactionalism and the degree to which the countries are prepared, or even how they will cope with an increasingly confrontational posture by the Trump administration towards China, does vary a bit, region by region, sub-region by sub-region, I guess, and frankly, country by country. So in Northeast Asia, what I'd say is on the security side, both the major allies, Japan and Korea, are going to be under tremendous pressure to increase their funding for the support of U.S. troops that are stationed there, host nation support, it's called. They know this is coming. They saw this already in Technicolor in Trump 1. And both governments have taken some steps, such as they can, to try to get ahead of it. But without a doubt, this push is going to put real strain on the alliances with both countries. I think both of the allies in Northeast Asia are deeply concerned about how Donald Trump might deal with North Korea. The risk that he would act without coordination, the risk that he might make a deal with his dear friend Kim Jong-un and sideline Japanese and South Korean interests in the mix. I think they also worry very much about what Trump might do and what Trump might demand that they do in the confrontation against China. Will they be pushed to match U.S. hardline policies up and down the line? They've both been on the receiving end of really nasty Chinese economic retaliation for political actions in the past, both Japan and Korea, and they don't want to relive that experience, and they didn't feel, frankly, that the United States did enough to protect and safeguard them when it did happen. They are both facing some economic difficulties domestically. They're trying to reduce their own economic trade dependencies on China. So this is all converging at what's a pretty tough time for the countries in Northeast Asia. I'd say in Northeast Asia, Taiwan is probably at the greatest risk from Trump's transactionalism. You know, he's already staked out some wildly aggressive demands for Taiwan's defense spending. He's called into question whether the US could even defend or would even defend Taiwan. He's accused them of stealing the US semiconductor industry. So they're in a delicate position. If Trump is too tough on China, that raises the risk to Taiwan. If Trump does a deal with China, that raises the risk that they wind up as just a bargaining chip. Now, Southeast Asia, I'd say, is a much more mixed picture. All of the countries in Southeast Asia, varying degrees, are going to be hurt by tariffs. For Southeast Asia, it's really all about the economy. So this is a concern. In terms of the geopolitics, the relationships, you know, some of the countries are very, very skilled at what they call bamboo diplomacy, the arbitrage, maneuvering, navigating between the big powers. Look at Singapore, look at Vietnam. And after all, these are countries that have millennia of experience dealing with China. That's one of the reasons they want the United States present as a stabilizing security force, as a counterweight to China. But there's an equilibrium, a balance that they want so they can get the best of both worlds. Now, I think some of the countries are going to be perfectly happy to have another Trump administration that doesn't seem to want to pressure them over human rights and good governance issues, that kind of thing. Others, like the Philippines, undoubtedly have very serious concerns about whether US security guarantees are going to hold at all, and or the extent to which facilities in their country are going to be used by the Americans in the event of a crisis on Taiwan. I think in Southeast Asia more broadly, the grouping ASEAN is going to find that its cohesion, which is always a little bit threadbare, is going to be strained even more than it currently is by these tensions. It's going to be harder and harder for the 10 countries in ASEAN, Timor-Leste, soon to be 11, to hammer out and hold to common positions, given the powerful pull and push factors on each of them by each of the two major powers. So the last point I'd make simply is that every country in East Asia certainly worries about two extremes. The risk that Donald Trump and Xi Jinping will go overboard, will overdo it, that the relationship will stumble into some kind of incident, some kind of conflict, even a war over Taiwan or the South China Sea, something that has devastating effects. But they're also equally worried about the risk that Donald Trump and Xi Jinping have a great dinner in Mar-a-Lago and arrive at some sort of self-interested deal between the superpowers that effectively creates a G2 arrangement that marginalizes the interests of the third countries, or that effectively divides Asia into spheres of influence that really traps those countries in a subordinate relationship to great powers.
Thank you, Danny. That was extremely insightful. In fact, I'd say if US policy towards China shifts, then a lot of countries in Asia would be impacted, but South Asia would also be impacted. India, for one, will be watching this relationship very closely because a lot bets on the US's confrontation to China when it comes to US-India dynamic. Coming back to you, Kamran, Dr. Lodhi discussed this a little bit about the last 4 years under President Biden in terms of the relationship the United States has had with Pakistan. It's been largely unstable, no phone calls from the president to the prime minister in Pakistan, no visits. But could you just walk us through some of the highlights or key developments, say, of the last few years, including the previous Trump administration? How do you see the relationship working out going forward? What were some of the key highlights of the past, say, many years that would set the template for the relationship that we'll see in the coming years?
Interesting question. That we often say that Pakistan-US relationship have always been transactional, and the shift that we started seeing even during the second term of President Obama, when US was looking for a way out from Afghanistan. And at that time, it was evident that once the US forces were pulled out from Afghanistan, Pakistan will no longer have the same relevance that it used to enjoy for 15, 16 years. And then you talked about President Trump during his first term. There is interesting debate, of course, in Pakistan when the elections were taking place in the US, that who is a better candidate for Pakistan, Republicans or the Democrats. And somehow, I think people in Pakistan, majority of them probably think that Trump may be a better choice. And probably they look at the optics during the first term of President Trump. For example, when he took over, he, despite his pre-election rhetoric against Pakistan regarding Pakistan's role in the fight against terrorism, he invited then Prime Minister Imran Khan to the White House. Then he met him twice on other occasions. But people actually often forget that despite those optics, when you talk about the substantive part, during President Trump's first term, US has never appointed a full-time ambassador in Pakistan. Secondly, he was the one, whatever assistance that Pakistan was getting before President Trump, he simply, cut it off, all the security and the civilian assistance, and even decades-long, the military training program the Pakistani army really had in the US. He also suspended that, although later it was revived. So if you look at the President Trump's first term, people sometimes misjudged it. They looked at the White House invite and a couple of other meetings with then Pakistani Prime Minister. They thought that he's a good choice, but in reality, during his term, relationship actually were transactional and never took off. And you spoke about President Biden, and it was quite surprising that Biden was the president who knew Pakistan well. He, a veteran Foreign Affairs, Relations Committee chairman. He visited Pakistan several times. As vice president, he knew Pakistan well. And it was quite surprising that when still tens of thousands of US troops were next door in Afghanistan, he never opted to make a telephone call either with Prime Minister Imran Khan, then with Shehbaz Sharif. So that clearly illustrates that in the US eye, Pakistan is no more relevant. Even this happened during the time when US still needed Pakistan's help when it comes to Afghanistan. Now, look at the situation. During President Trump's first term, there was no Gaza crisis, there was no Ukraine war, there was no crisis in Syria. And now, given the fact that still US troops were on the ground in Afghanistan, now look at the situation. US is no more interested in Afghanistan, and then President Trump's agenda is full of domestic issues, and then keeping an eye on all these hotspots that we are talking about in the Middle East and even in Ukraine. So in this situation, I think the relationship will only, I believe, in Pakistan-US relationship we talk about will go downhill. In fact, I was in China recently, came back earlier this week, and there they feel that under President Trump, they said that US will be inwards. And when the US will be inwards, according to the Chinese assessment, this means that we say in Pakistan that, okay, still there is a room for cooperation between Pakistan and US when it comes to counterterrorism. But Chinese feel that even when it comes to counterterrorism in this region, under President Trump, there is a possibility that cooperation will not be there. And the second thing that say that under President Trump, US will be more protectionist, as you already all talked about the tariffs and the other stuff. So in this, I think, scenario, relationship, I think, will remain transactional. The only thing that where Pakistan, I think, may face more pressure, in fact, once the dust settles down in Gaza, and there is a possibility that Trump may revive Abraham Accord and ask other Arab countries to, accept or recognize Israel. And we saw during his first term that there were reports that Pakistan was under pressure from some of our Arab friends who wanted us to open some channels of communication with Israel. I think so. A difficult scenario, I believe, for Pakistan, and history is the best guide. If we see President Trump's first term and President Biden's, term, relationship between Pakistan and US, of course, only going, I think, remain unstable, and I think there will be a lot of ups and downs during Trump's time as well.
Thank you, Kamran. You don't seem very hopeful about this relationship between US and Pakistan, which calls for a time for not only introspection for Pakistan, but also to work out some ways in which there could be this road towards this long-sought reset that Pakistan has been hoping for and been talking about with the United States. So coming to you, Dr. Lodhi, you're somebody who's served both in Washington, D.C. and New York. You know the ebbs and flows of the relationships, what has worked, what hasn't worked. How would you recommend Pakistan to approach a second Trump presidency? What are some of the cooperation areas, keeping in mind the transactional approach, keeping in mind that Afghanistan is no longer the lens, and counterterrorism would likely not be the anchoring factor? How would you suggest Pakistan to approach this relationship now?
I think I'd like to step back for a minute, because we have been discussing all of this, but we haven't quite discussed this in the overall global environment. The United States, there's no unipolarity in the world anymore. So I think, maybe other countries are obsessed with their relationship with the United States, but I don't think my country is. The world has changed. I don't even think it's bipolar. I think we are increasingly entered a phase where it's a multipolar world, where there are many countries that exercise influence and can shape global geopolitics. So I think we need to keep that in view, because we're not talking about the Pakistan-US relationship in the old environment where the United States was the sole superpower. Yes, there are two global powers in the world, United States and China, but they do not influence outcomes throughout the world. So it's not bipolar by any stretch of the imagination. Now, coming to the Pakistan-US relationship in this context, this is a relationship which is at another inflection point. And in fact, it's the third time that the two countries are confronted with the challenge of redefining their relationship, which has been so volatile over time. And we know that the roller coaster nature of the relationship has meant that it has lurched in the past between close engagement and deep estrangement. And at times it happens simultaneously. So I think, we have to keep that in view, as well as the fact that positive transformation in relations were almost always driven by events, geopolitical storms, or factors that were extraneous to bilateral ones. So in other words, it was not Pakistan's intrinsic importance, but factors which were extraneous to this bilateral relationship that shaped the Pakistan-US relationship. So, if we just look at history, and I don't want to go into history, but I think it's there for all of us to see. So I think one of the things that Pakistan has always wanted was to have a relationship with the United States, which isn't a function of a third country, which it has been for the last, 20, perhaps more years because of Afghanistan. So I think this is where the challenge lies. So if Pakistan looks towards a reset, and it looks towards a reset by no imagination at the expense of its relationship with China. So I think one of the things that, you had mentioned earlier in your introduction was America's Indo-Pacific strategy, and whether Pakistan, the question then arises, does Pakistan have a role? And I would answer that by saying, no, it does not have a role. It does not wish to have a role, because it sees that as aimed at China, at containing China, and getting countries to join an anti-China coalition. That's a red line for Pakistan. There's no way that Pakistan will ever do that. I think we also have to bear in mind, again, I'll revert for a second to the global landscape. The global landscape shows us that this is also an era of middle powers. So in other words, there are countries that are playing off the US-China competition, wanting good relations with both, but at the same time, in a way, distancing themselves up to a point from both. And yet, as I said, seeking good ties. I mean, a case in point is Turkey. Turkey plays the role of a middle power extremely well. I think the Saudis are also playing that role. So I think in the future, perhaps this is where Pakistan would want to go, to also play the role of a middle power. But I do think that in the near term, as we look at the reset, there are 4 areas I think that will impact on this bilateral relationship. The first is, of course, we've discussed this, and I'll just flag it again, which is containment of China, America's policy to contain China, and therefore viewing Pakistan through the China lens. The second is, of course, the United States' relationship with India, and therefore, again, looking at Pakistan through India's lens, because that's a relationship that is critical for the United States, because it sees India to a large extent as a counterweight to China. I think the third area that will impact is how the situation in Afghanistan will play itself out. Not because the Trump administration is going to be very interested in Afghanistan, but to the point that if Afghanistan again dissolves into some kind of a chaotic situation where we see a resurgence of the kind of groups that could pose a threat to Western interests, then yes, that would impact on the bilateral relationship. The fourth area, I think, is very important, something that I write about all the time, which is it depends on Pakistan's own repositioning, its ability to strengthen itself economically, to create the kind of environment which is one of political and economic stability, and therefore to be attractive to the United States as a destination for investment, as a country that it wants to have a relationship with, because Pakistan's potential is there. It's unrealized, of course. Its potential as the second largest Muslim power in the world, as a nuclear weapon state, as potentially a very large market. This is a country of 240 million people. It's a country that's played a very active diplomatic role in the past. But of course, we know the reasons why it began to lose its, what Kamran rightly calls, its relevance in Washington's eyes. So I think this is a very challenging scenario for Pakistan, and therefore will require, I think, a great deal of imagination on the part of the Pakistani government if it wishes to engage the Trump administration. And I would end with an anecdote, because I happened to have attended a meeting between President Trump and former Prime Minister Imran Khan in New York. And yes, it is true that it is interests that guide countries. But I could not help but sort of observing and noting the way these two leaders got along like a house on fire. I mean, it came as a bit of a surprise to me because I had never seen the two together. So I'm not saying it's going to translate into anything significant for the bilateral relationship, but I do think sometimes, and I think we tend to de-emphasize it when we do heavy-duty analysis, the role of personality in foreign policy and in domestic policy too. Often in diplomacy, I mean, I've been a diplomat for many years of my life, personal relationships do count. They make a difference. They can have an impact. So, you know, for example, when President Trump says, it's nothing to do with my country, when he says he likes President Xi Jinping, you know, it would make a difference because he sees him as somebody that he can cut a deal with. So similarly, I think we have to sort of, in a way, factor in what is the personality sort of factor. Here is President Trump, a larger-than-life figure. And I think his personality is going to dominate US foreign policy. I mean, he can have any number of hawks on China as he wants, but ultimately, he will define US policy. It's not going to be his advisors. I mean, he will sort of, you know, weigh in on his advisors anytime. He can sack any of them as he used to do in his first term when he didn't like somebody. Well, out they went. So I think we need to keep that in mind and not kind of get too sort of focused on, as I said, heavy-duty analysis, which sort of de-emphasizes the personality factor in shaping foreign policy and in shaping relations with countries, including my country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lodhi. I completely agree with you. This is a multipolar world, but I also agree with you that it's very important for countries to get their house in order, and we are talking about Pakistan in this context, to have economic and political stability, to have a more affirmative foreign policy, whether it's in terms of engaging with the United States or any other country for that matter. And of course, President-elect Trump is known for a more personal way of dealing with leaders across the world. He's also called Prime Minister Modi his great friend. So interesting times ahead. You've in part answered a question that we received from one of our audience members today, Gul Baloch, on the relevance of Pakistan or the role Pakistan could play in Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy. But I want to kind of also talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy in its whole. Danny, if I could ask you, what do you see? How do you see the future of the Indo-Pacific strategy under Trump 2.0, but also with regards to the multilaterals that are involved with supporting the Indo-Pacific strategy, mainly the Quad?
Well, I think Ambassador Lodhi made some really terrific points, and they're directly germane to this. One is the power of human agency and the role that leaders can play, and especially an outsized personality like Donald Trump in shaping national policies and impacting the geopolitical, geoeconomic scene. And it is very important to differentiate between the things and the kinds of policies that are going to be a function of the advisors, the cabinet secretaries, the bureaucracy in the Trump administration, and those things that catch the attention of the leader, Donald Trump, and that he chooses to act on and interact on. And they can be radically different policies that he opts for than what his people had been plotting and signaling up until that point. So starting there, I think that there is considerable continuity in the approach to the Indo-Pacific strategy, including the Quad, between the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now the second Trump administration at the institutional level. Now, the Quad was treated by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo much more as an instrument for putting pressure on China than as a collaborative diplomatic vehicle for providing public goods to the countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, which is the approach of the Biden administration. But nevertheless, there was a strong focus on in the Indo-Pacific strategy, integrating the East Asia and the South Asia theaters, particularly with India as the kind of fulcrum point there. And that the organizing principle, as others have pointed out, behind the Indo-Pacific strategy was contending with the challenges of a rising China and an assertive China. So structurally, I don't think it's going to change, but I do think that when you sort of take those two moving pieces, the personality piece and the sort of China orientation piece, that what we are likely to see in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy is a bit of a reversal, so that the question is less, what does the United States need to do on behalf of the region and to galvanize the region to do more, do better, some of it focused specifically on pushing back on China, but some of it focused on helping to generate outcomes and products that the countries in the region want, whether it's in public health or it's high tech, it's in maritime domain awareness, these global goods. To shift from there to something more akin to what have you done for me lately? How is this configuration of Indo-Pacific countries advancing my America First agenda? What do their trade numbers look like? What are their contributions to various initiatives, including defense spending and so on? What kind of direct foreign investment does the US get? What sorts of investment opportunities do we get? And on top of that, who's my friend in the region? Who do I like dealing with? And what do they care about? I think to Ambassador Lodhi's point, it's easy to forget that in the first Trump administration, strong leaders, including Xi Jinping, were able to speak to Donald Trump and on the spot get him to agree to do things that his advisors and his allied partners would have vigorously opposed had they been consulted. We saw this not just with China, but with the leader of North Korea, where Donald Trump didn't even consult his military advisors before announcing that he was going to grant Kim Jong-un's wish that the United States would stop conducting joint defensive training with South Korea. Boom. So there are lots of possibilities. I think, though, that we will see a shift in thinking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, not as a collective mission, but as a field to be harvested for the benefit of the United States, and that the Quad would, in all likelihood, shift back away from a role of global goods provision to more service as a blunt instrument against China.
Thank you, Danny. Just also to kind of give my 2 cents on the Indo-Pacific strategy and if there is an elevation of the strategy or expansion of the strategy, let's say, in a way that the US administration is paying more attention to the region, of course, speaking beyond Pakistan, other countries in the region, India, goes without saying, will have an important role to play. But there's also a role for Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Bangladesh, in fact, has its own Indo-Pacific outlook that it released a couple of years ago, I believe. And so that could be some sort of an engagement strategy that these countries could pursue in order to work with the United States in the Indo-Pacific region. We can perhaps take one more question before we close. So if I could come back to you, Dr. Lodhi and Kamran, for your quick reflections on this. Should there be a conflict between US and China? Could Pakistan protect itself from that sort of an entanglement, but also global entanglements? And I'm going to couple this up with another question that we received, which is about Pakistan's role in the current global conflicts, especially in the Middle East. So, Dr. Lodhi, if I could come to you first, and we can have Kamran next.
Well, I mean, I really don't see a conflict between the United States and China. I see an intensifying competition, but a conflict, I mean, that's not something that I think is in the interest of either country. And certainly President Trump, I mean, President-elect Trump, who has said so many times that he is against any kind of conflict, wars, he wants to end wars. I really don't foresee that. But to the part of your question, which says, well, how does Pakistan then navigate between the two in such intense confrontation? Well, I think Pakistan has said many times that it does not want to get in any way into the crosshairs of this superpower competition. But that's easier said than done. It's very easy to say that. But when it comes down to practical policy, as I said before, I will just reiterate, Pakistan's strategic interests lie with China today. China is Pakistan's strategic priority. And not that Pakistan, I think, will ever be asked to choose between the two. But should that choice come, my answer to that is very easy. The choice will be China, not the United States, because today it does not really have, I mean, I don't see any strategic convergence between the United States and Pakistan. Sure, Pakistan wants to have a good, solid, stable relationship with the United States. So don't get me wrong. It's not as if this is, Pakistan has two critical bilateral relationships. One is with China and the other is with the United States. So that's not going to change. But I think, a conflict, I just don't see one. But as I said, this is a challenge to navigate between these two superpowers. What was this other aspect of your question? I forget now. I'm losing the thread. There's another.
Pakistan's role in current global conflicts, especially in the Middle East.
Pakistan is so preoccupied by its domestic crises, and there isn't one. I mean, I've often said Pakistan faces a polycrisis. There are several crises that are converging to create a bigger challenge than any single one of them. So I don't think Pakistan once had a fairly active role in the Middle East, diplomatic role in the Middle East. It doesn't have that anymore. It simply doesn't have the same kind of clout anymore. It also has very difficult relationships with three of its neighbors, all three of its neighbors, except for the fourth, which is China. All three, it has troubled relations. So I don't think, Pakistan is in no position right now. And as I said before, and I want to conclude on this note, all foreign policy begins at home. And therefore, until and unless Pakistan is able to strengthen itself domestically, to strengthen its economy, and to put an end to the political squabbles that undermine both its unity as well as its image, it will not be able to play the kind of role that perhaps it did in the past vis-a-vis the Middle East and other regions of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Lodhi. We just at time. Kamran, do you have any quick reflections to add?
I agree with Dr. Maleeha Lodhi. Despite the confrontation or tension between the US and China, I think there are less chances of any major conflict. But even if there is one, I believe that Pakistan will try to make sure that whatever role it plays, it does not, come at the cost of interest of China or the US. I know it's a difficult proposition, but Pakistan has shown previously, even when it comes to the crisis in the Middle East, tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Pakistan has shown that it did maintain a certain delicate balance despite all the challenges. So I think if this situation arises, Pakistan will be able to maintain that kind of a challenge. The advantage that Pakistan has, unlike the US, probably the Chinese diplomacy is different. They won't put pressure on Pakistan. As I mentioned earlier, that I was in China recently, and one of the Chinese speakers made a very interesting comment that when Pakistan joined, the Sito-Cento alliance, so the Pakistani Prime Minister went to China and met with the Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai and informed him that Pakistan was going to be part of the US alliance against communism. And we wanted to make sure that your interest won't be hurt. And the Chinese Prime Minister at that time, Zhou Enlai, said that this is a great development for us, that we want our great and trusted friend to be part of an alliance that is led by our adversary. So we believe that if you are part of that alliance, you will protect our interests. So this is how China look at it. And I believe that if the situation arises, given the history, Pakistan will be able to manage, I think, its relationship both with China and the US. And overall, again, I endorse Dr. Maleeha's role, the role in the international or global issues such as in the Middle East. Previously, Pakistan was one of the prominent players, but now it is preoccupied with so much domestic issues. I don't think so. It can play a role, or rather, at this time, it is also, aspiring to play that kind of a role.
Thank you, Kamran. And with that, we have run into overtime. But thank you very much, Danny, Kamran, Dr. Lodhi, for your valuable insights. So much food for thought. I'm sure our audience really enjoyed the conversation, found it very interesting. Thank you, everyone who joined us online. Please stay in touch with the Asia Society Policy Institute, with the Asia Society. Subscribe to our South Asia Snapshot. And since we are in that time of the year, wish you all a prosperous and a happy new year. Thank you.